Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explain It. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who prepared for today's episode by scrolling on Twitter, Reddit, and eating some Reese's Pieces. And
someone who, despite saying at various points as a kid, I'll never be a teacher or a lawyer, those are the worst jobs ever, has done both of those things. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
But then come back. Please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional and facts could change at any time. Do your own research. All right, Martin. Today we're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to follow up on our first episode where we talked about gerrymandering, which, as we discussed, is often racially motivated.
And if you haven't listened to our first episode, please go back and check it out.
Martin, what do you know about the Voting Rights Act? And listeners, in addition to being a law nerd, Martin is a big fan of Jeopardy, so I wouldn't be surprised if he knows a lot about it.
Honestly, right before we were recording, I started thinking about it, and I don't think I could confidently say anything about the Voting Rights Act. I really did prepare for today's episode, like scrolling Twitter and Reddit right before we started recording and eating my Reese's Pieces. But yeah, I mean, I assume it granted voting rights for Black people, like, because historically Black people in America have been disenfranchised. So I assume it protected states, probably in the South, from or protected people from states in the South enacting laws that didn't allow people to vote.
That's a fair summary. And we're going to get into in greater detail what the Voting Rights Act covers. But because I know you love Jeopardy and all things trivia, I also want to ask you, do you know which president signed it into law?
I think it was Lyndon Johnson.
Okay. You did not fully put respect on his name with the Lyndon B. Johnson, but yes.
B. Johnson, LBJ.
That is the correct president. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. Didn't he, I mean, despite the circumstances when he came into office, he actually kind of continued the legacy of civil rights from that JFK was kind of building. And surprisingly, this old white guy from Texas actually was pretty progressive on civil rights, right?
I mean, he did help us get to the point where we have this monumental piece of legislation. So yeah, I think that's fair to say. Not a perfect person, but who is? But yes, that is right, that he did continue a lot of the work that President Kennedy had initiated. And as we start to get into the topic of today, I want us to take a moment to celebrate because the Voting Rights Act turned 59 this month. We're recording in August 2024. So, Martin, I can picture various friends of mine singing the Black version of Happy Birthday right now in honor of this very momentous occasion.
Happy birthday. Am I supposed to start singing? Is that what you were?
You know, I'm
not Black.
I actually, as I was putting this script together, I just left a placeholder for Martin's reaction because I was very curious what you were going to come up with.
What that made me think of was when your balsa friends were singing to me at one of your other balsa friends' wedding because it happened to turn my birthday after midnight.
Yes, that's
a specific memory I could think of.
So I think that's perfect. And for listeners who are wondering what BALSA is, it is one of the student organizations at many law schools, the Black Law Students Association. And Martin is alluding to a time when various of my friends from said organization, we post-graduation had gotten together at a wedding, and that wedding coincided with Martin's birthday. And so there was singing and dancing and fanfare. I also want to point out that for listeners who might be curious about what the Black version of Happy Birthday even is, that would be the Stevie Wonder version. And don't let the internet tell you anything different. Go listen to it after this episode. All right, so back to the pod. We'll kick things off with some history. Some listeners might know this part well, and in fact, may have lived through it. I really want us to be grounded in knowing that this important history was not too long ago. As some context, my parents were school age when the Voting Rights Act became law. Martin, any reactions to just the recency of that?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's something that we should have studied in school, and there are countless examples of it wasn't that long ago that always, I think, hits home. So that's super important fact, and it's crazy to think about your parents living in the world that they had to live in.
Like any reasonable person of our era, yes, even lawyers, I started my research for this episode on, drumroll please, Wikipedia. I ran across one really interesting fact. Martin, can you read what the Department of Justice said about the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, the Department of Justice said the Voting Rights Act, quote, has been called the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress.
Thanks. Let's talk more about why it's so important in the context leading up to its ratification. Listeners, a lot of this summary comes from the National Archives website, archives.gov. This is a short podcast, so we're not going to dive super deep into all that led to the Voting Rights Act. So like we always say, do your own research. Martin, what would you guess is the primary purpose of the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, I also just happened to pull up Wikipedia as a layman. But yeah, again, I think it was just securing the right to vote for Black men, because I think that was like kind of the first evolution to voting how it is today, where every person should be able to vote, asterisk.
It's a solid guess, and we're gonna dive in and kind of go piece by piece. So to start, the text of the law itself says, an act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Civics history moment, Martin. What's the 15th Amendment? Listeners, I need you to know that Martin is consulting his pocket constitution.
Ooh, that's a good cue. I was going to Wikipedia. Let's see, the 15th Amendment. First, it's kind of crazy that there has to be a congressional act to what they say enforce the 15th Amendment. Like,
there doesn't have to be, but
exactly. So, this is probably a whole other can of worms. Like, isn't the passing of the 15th Amendment, shouldn't that make it the law of the land? I guess up for interpretation into individual precedent or instances to debate. But
so as you're gathering the text, just to respond, yes, completely agree. But then one would also think, did we even need the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? Because, wow, this whole President Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation thing, that should have done it. But nope, it did not. Pocket Constitution says?
Handy Pocket Constitution says Amendment 15. There's an asterisk here, which says it was ratified February 3rd, 1870. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So I guess, does that tie it back? Congress can use their power to enforce the article by this appropriate legislation, i.e. the Voting Rights Act.
It's true. And it gives the sort of extra, a term that lawyers love to use, belt and suspenders, if a sort of executive act doesn't do enough. But again, should this be necessary is a great question. Martin, as our resident layman, can you break this amendment down into layperson's terms?
Yeah, I can do my best here. It seems pretty straightforward, right? It says if you're a citizen of the United States, either the federal government, the United States itself, or by any state within the United States, cannot deny or abridge. So, I don't know, limit or, gosh, I'm trying to think of how else, restrict your ability to vote. And it specifies on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which is blowing my mind reading that out loud right now, because that's not how it works in the States. Gosh, yeah. And then the second part we kind of touched on is that Section 2 is that Congress can pass legislation. I think also, side comment without going too far, without a reaction to that, the fact that it was ratified in 1870, right? We're talking Civil War times, and the Voting Rights Act was mid 60s, so 100 years later is when Congress finally used their power to enforce. And in simple language, right? It just seems kind of like we talked about in episode 1, which again, if you haven't listened, go back and check it out. It seems like that is such of the founding principle of the United States, is that citizens have the right to vote, right? But I think as we learn history, we learn more and more that isn't necessarily the case, nor has it been.
So I just want to let listeners know I've been nodding extremely intensely as Martin's been giving his layperson summary. The fact that we're even having this podcast episode, let alone that we had to have the Voting Rights Act, let alone that we had to have the 15th Amendment, says a lot for those who are less familiar with United States history. And I also want to circle back to a point that Martin made about the 15th Amendment enabling Black men or men of color to vote. Also, for those who are not familiar with United States history, it took the 19th Amendment to permit women to be able to vote. So there's that. Things move real slowly in terms of evolutions in political history and developments. That said, so Martin's commenting also on just the timing between the 15th Amendment's passage and then the Voting Rights Act. Martin, why do you think it was that almost 100 years passed for us to get to the Voting Rights Act?
Oh boy, here we go. This is actually something that I feel a little bit more able to speak to because, as we mentioned in episode 1, we have read through the Equal Justice Initiative's published articles or little books.
Reports.
Yes. Thank you. We've read Equal Justice Initiative's reports on various histories of the United States, and particularly with Reconstruction. And I think what I learned and what I took away from those reports is that despite having these moments, as we said in episode 1, where racism was over and everything's good now, I think every step of the way, every victory, we saw nothing but a backlash. So that's why I think it took 100 years, because yeah, sure, Civil War was over. Okay, then we had Reconstruction to try to build back the states, change their economy from being slave labor, based on slave labor, and protecting the rights that were just fought for. And then there's just always been this pushback.
Well said. Very well said. And so that folks can get some more color as to exactly what was happening leading up to 1965, check out the archives link that we're going to include in our resources. At the time, Black folks in the South were facing tremendous obstacles to voting, including poll taxes, literacy taxes, and other bureaucratic restrictions to deny them the right to vote. So that was a slight paraphrase there, but, folks had to pay. They had to prove they could read. They had to prove their lineage was of a certain type in order to vote.
All these impossible tasks, right? Like there were also literally impossible tests that were given.
Right. So I'm going to set the scene for you leading up to the Voting Rights Act. It's the 1960s. Black people and allies are out in the streets peacefully protesting, dressed to the nines, of course, while facing brutal treatment and all kinds of repercussions for trying to exercise their constitutional right. I imagine one of my grandparents or granduncles or aunties or grandcousins, I'm not sure if that last one is a thing, feeling so disrespected and frustrated and being like, this really important piece of paper that our whole country is built upon says that I can't be denied the right to vote because of my skin color, and I'm literally being denied the right to vote because of my skin color, and I can't take it another minute. And it took the murder of civil rights activists and police brutality in a place called Selma, Alabama, to get the attention of our guy, LBJ, who was like, you know what? I think they might have a point. So I wouldn't say that I'd invite him to the cookout per se, but I give him credit for setting in motion a tremendously important piece of legislation that allows me to vote without having to prove I can read. Martin, why do you think after decades, nay, centuries of disenfranchisement, the Voting Rights Act finally became law? Like, how did it happen? What's your guess?
I'm trying to recall the gentrified whitewash version that we were all taught in elementary school. And actually, we also went to, I forget which museum. It was African American History Museum. Well, we went to the one in DC, but also in Georgia. And I think like the one that also where the Venn diagram lines up between reality and history and that, and what we were taught in school is busing, boycotts and protests, sit-ins, civil disobedience.
Yes, that's exactly what was happening. And pressure, essentially. It was the amount of pressure that was enough to get LBJ to pick up a pen and sign. Martin, do you like numbers? Also, I just had a thought mid-sentence. I think it's the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, but we will double check the names so that listeners can be aware of the various resources that are available in the United States where you can learn more about Black history.
If we do want to rewind to that, the Civil Rights Museum, or whichever museum that it was in Atlanta, was extremely powerful and moving. And it was similar to, what did I say earlier? There are countless examples of, it wasn't that long ago. There's countless examples of, it was way worse than we were taught, and grueling, excruciating, longer. We were talking about dogs or hoses, physical beatings,
assassination attempts, and successful assassinations. Yeah. Those museums, I think, are such an important thing to preserve, to teach, and to even have this tiny little bit of experience. It's moving to see, I think, all these stories collected into one place. Martin, how do you feel about numbers?
I do like numbers. I feel like I was decent in math in school. Cool.
Well, here are some. Again, this is coming from the archives.
I don't know if I like these numbers.
You might. I quote, by the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered, 1/3 by federal examiners. By the end of 1966, only 4 of 13 southern states had fewer than 50% of African Americans registered to vote. So within months, the Voting Rights Act had a huge impact on Black people that had formerly been shut out of voting. Thoughts?
That's crazy. As much as we talk that stuff doesn't change overnight, the franchise for that many people is that can change things. Like that really could change things. Similar to the Voting Rights Act itself, those votes can put pressure on people potentially. That's wild. Can you run the numbers by one more time? It was how many million were?
So same year of the Voting Rights Act being signed, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered. By the end of the following year, only 4 out of 13 southern states had less than 50% of Black voters registered.
That's incredible. And the impact that same year, but also over time. I've heard this said before about Black people within the Black community, is that it's never good to be the first Black whatever. I can't imagine how many people out there, were afraid to register to vote, thinking maybe it was a trick, thinking it was who knows, thinking maybe it didn't matter where they lived. Maybe the intimidation they faced, yeah, sure, it's legal, but yeah,
it's not easy. Yeah. We know there are historical examples. I shouldn't say we know what, but there are historical examples of the first Black child to integrate a school. There's tremendous pressure on that first Black person who does something, and a ton of risk was taken, again, so that I today am able to vote really quite easily and conveniently to me. All right. So we're going to fast forward a bit to 2013 when the Shelby County case that we talked about in our first episode was decided. Martin, bear with me as I explain some parts that I realized I rushed through in our first episode. Are you ready? Are you buckled in?
I think, yeah, I'm all buckled up.
Pocket Constitution ready, like at your side.
Reese's
Perfect.
Pieces within arm's reach.
Okay. As tends to be the case with important laws in the United States, the Voting Rights Act has a ton of words and multiple sections. So one of the sections, Section 5, required, and the past tense is important here, required certain state and local governments to run any new voting procedures by a federal court or the U.S. Attorney General. This requirement was called preclearance. Do you remember hearing that term preclearance in our first episode?
Yes, I was going to say this sounds pretty familiar.
Perfect. So another part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4B, set a formula for which jurisdictions had to obtain the preclearance, aka the jurisdictions that were too obvious with their racism and got cut. In terms of how preclearance actually worked, I'm picturing something like this. Ahem. Dear United States Attorney General, I'm in charge of election processes, and I'm also super racist. I'd like to request approval for a new process requiring the coloreds to have to write their full names with both hands and both feet before casting a ballot. Please check yes or no. Best regards. This is not exactly how it went, but again, I like to picture colorfully. As you can imagine, the preclearance requirement made it a little harder, probably not impossible, but some level of challenging to impose arbitrary and discriminatory voting practices. And this was, again, until the United States Supreme Court in 2013 decided that the formula for determining which jurisdictions had to obtain preclearance was unconstitutional. So to say that another way, the Supreme Court decided that the Section 4B formula was unconstitutional, which effectively meant that preclearance under Section 5 was no longer required. So to make that clear again, Section 5 itself was not deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it effectively became meaningless because the formula for determining preclearance became unconstitutional. Martin, with this knowledge, do you have a better idea of the impact of the Shelby County decision?
Yeah, I did not think that it would come back to haunt us, but of course, I feel like that might be a recurring theme. It's wild. It's wild that they tie them together, the two different sections. When you first mentioned the formula, I was curious about that, and I'd be curious about what the formula actually entails. But yeah, it's just wild that they can tie it together because it seems in a vacuum like they were separate sections because the latter was Section 5 was about actually what was required, like the pre-clearance that they needed. That really seems to be the meat and potatoes of the law. And yet on a technicality, they focus on the formula, and then that destroys, I guess, all of the teeth that the act has, it sounds like.
Oh, there's more. But to your point about the interrelated sections of the Voting Rights Act, because there's so many parts that are so closely related, despite it being a very long and sort of wordy measure, not very long, I guess, maybe relative to other things, but it's a decent amount of text. And so sort of poking holes in certain places could actually leave a really, really large gap. The Department of Justice released a blog post last year on the anniversary of the Shelby County decision, pointing out just how detrimental it was. I'm going to ask Martin to read the excerpt, even though I did not previously ask him to read the excerpt.
States wasted no time implementing election changes that had not or might not have survived the pre-clearance requirement. On June 25, 2013, the very day that the Supreme Court issued the Shelby County opinion, Texas officials announced that they would implement a discriminatory and burdensome photo identification statute. And on June 26, the day after the Shelby County decision, Senator Tom Apodaca, the chairman of the North Carolina Senate Rules Committee, publicly stated that the North Carolina legislature would be moving forward with an omnibus law imposing multiple voting restrictions. It continues. Untold numbers of voters were burdened or disenfranchised because the laws remained in place while the cases were pending.
Thanks, Martin, for reading that. And because there's a little bit of legalese and jargon in that quotation, I want to break down something for the listeners, which is when the North Carolina senator pointed out that the state was going to move forward with, quote, an omnibus law imposing multiple voting restrictions, it meant that they were going to have a big package, a big legislative package that had not one, not two, but probably many different blocks and obstacles for folks that were planning to cause a vote. And the fact that they had that ready on June 26th meant that they were just waiting for their moment for Shelby County to pass, just waiting on the edge of their seats so that they can put a law in place to pose obstacles to people that wanted to cast their vote. In that same post, the Department of Justice estimates that millions of voters of color were negatively impacted by the Shelby County decision. Martin, after reading this quotation and after learning more about the Department of Justice posts and their estimates of how many people were impacted by Shelby County, how do you feel?
Yeah, did not think Shelby County would come back to haunt us, but of course it would. That's probably a recurring theme. I think particularly with the quote that I read, it just seems vicious. It seems shady. It seems slimy to have legislation ready. It almost sounds, it feels like it's ripe for conspiracy theory and, backdoor deals, collusion. But I mean, even just at the straight up level, like these people were itching to take away the right to vote of other people, and the fact that it affected millions upon millions of people of color is just gross.
I'm sorry, I need to give our listeners context again on how young the Voting Rights Act is, as in how recent the issues were that prompted its passage, to underscore the grossness of these very recent Supreme Court decisions. Martin, question for you. What do Brad Pitt, Rob Lowe, Johnny Depp, and Jeff Bezos all have in common?
They're rich white guys.
Again, I wrote in my script a sort of placeholder for your reaction, but I figured that's what you were going to say. And while that's true, the point that I wanted to drive home is that they're all older than the Voting Rights Act.
Wow.
This 59 years young law still matters today, and it's in an even greater danger since the Shelby County decision.
I would say they all look to be in better shape than the Voting Rights Act does. But I'm rim shot somebody.
Definite rim shots right there.
I bet somebody is me, actually.
So we're going to fast forward a little bit more. There was a Supreme Court case decided in 2021 called Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, where the court looked at a different part of the Voting Rights Act, this time Section 2. So, Martin, you and I talked about not too long ago this fact that there's maybe one hole poked in the Voting Rights Act, and that's not a good thing. Turns out there are more. Also, side note, am I saying this name right? Brnovich. Martin, I'm going to send it to you so that you can see how it's spelled, because I want you to guess how you would say it.
Yeah, Brnovich.
So we're doing our best, and sorry if we're putting disrespect on the former Arizona Attorney General's name. Although, actually, I'm only a little sorry because he seems to have done some questionable things related to an investigation of 2020 election results in Arizona, which is a different topic for another episode, maybe? Yeah. Martin, any initial reactions just to this guy and his name?
Wow. Reactions to this guy and his name. I do feel like that's a whole other episode, potentially. Yeah, I'm trying to see how to phonetically say it. It's got to be Brnovich, though.
Listeners, you can tell us how we can learn how to pronounce consonants that don't have a vowel interrupting them. Also, side note to the side note, in this Supreme Court case, the defendant in the initial case was Brnovich, the Arizona Attorney General. But in the Supreme Court case, his name appears first, while the DNC, Democratic National Committee, was the plaintiff in the initial lawsuit, but their name appears second. There's a reason for that, because trials and appeals have to be difficult and things don't make sense in many law things. We'll cover that in another episode. All right, Martin, do you even know what we were talking about before all these side notes and digressions?
No, I'm a little lost.
All good. So we are now talking about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which contains language that tracks with the 15th Amendment that you so beautifully read for us. So let me set the scene and the context for you again. Bear with me again. In Level 1 of Brnovich, one argument that the DNC made was that Arizona's ballot counting and collection procedures negatively impacted the state's American Indian, Hispanic, and African American citizens in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. To get a little more specific, one thing that the DNC was challenging was a rule in Arizona that a vote made in the wrong precinct didn't count. And so listeners know I'm greatly simplifying here. You can imagine how easy it could be to accidentally vote in the wrong place if, say, you didn't fully understand the procedures, or if you didn't have access to the voting place where your mailing address is, but you actually live in your car or are crashing with a friend. So there's myriad reasons why a person might accidentally vote in the wrong precinct. So in the Brnovich history, the trial court rejected all of the DNC's claims. So the DNC lost on all of their claims, and the DNC appealed. Some appeals happened, which I'm greatly glossing over, and the case made it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court not only rejected the DNC's claims, but found that the voting procedures did not violate Section 2, which, like the 15th Amendment, because again, the language tracks very closely to the 15th Amendment, Section 2 is supposed to make it easier for people of color to vote, not harder. As you may have guessed, I did not read the full court opinion and implore you, dear listener, to do your own research. But to me, this ruling is kind of trash. And numerous advocacy organizations view Brnovich as a case that makes it harder to use the Voting Rights Act to challenge discriminatory election practices. And I'm going to have to agree. In fact, one article I read described, and Martin's going to keep me honest because he knows sports, described Shelby County as the alley-oop and Brnovich as the dunk. Martin, now that you've patiently sat through this exposition, does this all make sense? And what are your thoughts?
Excellent sports analogy. I think sounds accurate.
I didn't make it up again. It was in an article that I read. Can't take credit.
It's. I guess it makes sense in the context of the history. A little lost.
It's all good. So I'm glad Martin is pointing this out, because I realized in our first episode, as I was describing the Shelby County case, might have been a little ambitious to try to summarize in a few seconds/minutes these very complicated Supreme Court decisions. But the key points to keep in mind here are the Democratic National Committee. And for listeners who are not familiar, we have committees for our two main political parties. The DNC wanted to challenge certain voting procedures that were on the books in Arizona. And their challenge was, these procedures make it harder for people of color to vote. And a district court in Arizona disagreed with the arguments and found in favor of the Attorney General. And we will get into in another episode why a political organization might sue the Attorney General. Oftentimes that's the party to sue if you're going after a state process or procedure. Minor digression. So in this case, the Democratic National Committee lost on level 1. They appealed. Some things happened. They made it to the Supreme Court and they lost there as well. And the importance of this Brnovich case is that for many folks that do political advocacy, voting rights work, Brnovich represented yet another hole being poked at the Voting Rights Act. So if Shelby County was the hole that was poked at Section 5/4B, Brnovich was poked at Section 2. There's not that many sections of the Voting Rights Act. And so we have these two gaping holes that take this monumental piece of legislation, as Martin pointed out earlier in the episode, considered one of the most important pieces of legislation. Now we have these two gaping holes. So I ask listeners, I ask Martin, how effective can it be with these two gaping holes? Martin, does that help?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the summary helps it out so much. And like looking at the Wikipedia too, specifically, the tension was about Arizona's election policies, one outlawing ballot collection and another banning out of precinct voting, as you mentioned. And it's just, yeah, I mean, these poking of holes, it's wild. You know, you look at the 15th Amendment and it's less than 50 words and it seems pretty clear and straightforward, you know. However, of course, there's all these mental and maybe physical gymnastics done to try to undermine the spirit of what that amendment is saying. So,
Martin, implicit in what you're saying is that the Voting Rights Act has been significantly eroded, and listeners and you and I might be wondering what can be done to curtail this erosion. There has been a solution proposed. Martin, are you familiar with the John Lewis Act?
Yes, often cited as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
What do you know about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
I don't know what it details, but I imagine it's giving power back to the Voting Rights Act. And you know, obviously, John Lewis was a freedom rider, right? And one of the people who we mentioned earlier was riding on buses and protesting and being in the streets and being beat and hosed and had the dog sicked on him. For the act itself, I'm not sure what it details, but I imagine it gives maybe the federal government power again for pre-clearance and helping shape some of the state's election laws.
That is an excellent guess. I also just want to take a quick pause here to encourage listeners who are not familiar with the United States history or are not familiar with the Freedom Riders or the civil rights protests that happened in the sort of 1950s and 60s, and even before and after, to be totally honest. But if you're not familiar with who John Lewis is, highly recommend doing your research on him. What an incredible historical figure. And as Martin pointed out, he put himself at great bodily risk, great bodily harm. A lot happened to him physically, and he is an icon in civil rights history. So with that aside, Martin has pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of summarizing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act proposal. It's proposed to directly address Shelby County and Brnovich and to restore the rights that were established by the pre-clearance requirement and make it easier to challenge voting discrimination under Section 2. To give you some history, it passed the House vote in 2021 and 2022, but died in the Senate both times. And it's been reintroduced since, but still has not overcome all the various legislative hurdles. So, Martin, what do you think? I mean, do you think we need this act?
It seems like we do. I mean, just from what it details and how it's been used in an example. I mean, clearly we do. It's such an important thing to be able to vote. And every time, as we kind of mentioned in the episode, it seems like we reach these milestones and we win these victories, and yet every single time there's this backlash and this wave pushing back to try to, you know, take us one step backwards, but then we just have to keep stepping twice forward.
That's right. Well, listeners, we've reached the part of our episode where we give you a call to action. There's a lot here. Voting rights are being challenged, and voter suppression and intimidation is on the rise. This is in addition to Supreme Court decisions that make it much harder to challenge this kind of activity. But there are things that you can do. We're going to post some resources and make them available through our social media. There's a few ideas we have, and we encourage you to share if you have others. One thing to do is to know your rights, and the ACLU has some great guidance on knowing your voting rights. We also encourage you to contact your local officials. Contact them to champion and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act so that we can restore what the Shelby County and Brnovich decisions took away. Martin, any other ideas?
Yeah, as a layman, I think just exercising your right to vote, like we talked about in episode 1, it can be grueling. Sometimes it might seem meaningless, and what I'm saying probably sounds pretty cliche, but voting, and part of that is being as informed as you can, which is one of the reasons we wanted to do the podcast. We say, and we really mean, don't walk around not knowing.
We also want listeners to feel empowered. So it's not just that it's an era where individuals are maybe causing physical obstacles or literacy obstacles to a vote, but now we have technology enabling voter intimidation and suppression. So if something you heard on the internet doesn't sound right, it might not be. AI is also a tool that's being used to suppress votes. We will talk more about AI on future Lawyer and Layman episodes and how you can be informed, but we want you to just be on the lookout. If there's an image, some text, a video that doesn't sound right, question it. Also, check us out at Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram and Lawyer and Layman pretty much everywhere else. Let us know if there's any other topics you'd like us to explain. Don't walk around not knowing.